I still remember the sound of my alarm clock on a quiet weekday morning in the early 1970s. The house still half asleep, the smell of coffee already drifting from the kitchen, and a strange sense of calm that feels almost impossible to explain today. Before we go any further, let me say this. If these memories sound familiar, if they stir something warm or bittersweet inside you, take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel. These stories are for people like us, people who remember when life moved slower and meant something different. Back then, one paycheck supported a family, and somehow it was enough. Not enough for luxury, not enough for extravagance, but enough for dignity, stability, and peace of mind. I'm not talking about numbers on a spreadsheet or economic charts. I'm talking about the feeling of knowing that when my father left the house each morning in his worn jacket, lunch pail in hand, he was carrying the weight of our entire household, and he carried it with pride, not fear. In those days, you didn't constantly worry about layoffs, side hustles, or whether tomorrow would pull the rug out from under you. We lived modestly, yes, but there was comfort in routine. A single income paid the rent or the mortgage, kept food on the table, covered school clothes, and even left a little room for Sunday drives or a family movie night. I look around today, and it feels like that world vanished without anyone noticing it slip away. Now it takes 2 incomes, sometimes 3 jobs, and still the anxiety hums beneath everything. But in the 1970s, there was a shared understanding of limits. Limits to spending, limits to ambition, limits that actually made life feel safer. We didn't expect to have everything. We expected to make do, and somehow that made us richer. I remember my mother at home during the day, not because she lacked ambition, but because that was the rhythm of life then. The house was a place of order and care, not just a pit stop between shifts. Supper was at the same time every evening. Bills were paid with a check and a pen once a month, not tracked obsessively every hour through a glowing screen. When my father came home, tired but steady, there was a sense of completion to the day. Work stayed at work. Home stayed home. That separation alone feels like a lost luxury now. This story isn't about saying everything was perfect. It wasn't. But it's about remembering how one paycheck once carried an entire family, not just financially, but emotionally. It carried structure, identity, and a shared sense of purpose that shaped our childhoods and our hopes. As I tell you what life was really like in 1970s America, I want you to picture it not as history, but as lived experience. Because for many of us, it wasn't just a decade, it was the foundation of who we became. When I think back to how that single paycheck stretched, what amazes me most isn't the math, it's the mindset. We simply didn't live like people live now. There was no constant pressure to upgrade, replace, or prove anything. My father's salary came home once a week, sometimes every 2 weeks, in an envelope you could actually hold in your hand. My mother would sit at the kitchen table, lay out the bills in neat little stacks, and calmly assign each dollar its purpose. Rent first, utilities second, groceries next. And when all that was done, there was usually still enough left over for school supplies, a modest savings jar, and maybe a few dollars for a treat at the end of the week. That kind of order brought peace. Not because we were wealthy, we weren't, but because we knew where we stood. Today, money flows invisibly through apps and notifications, creating the illusion of abundance while feeding constant anxiety. Back then, you saw the limits clearly, and those limits made planning possible. We didn't dine out much. A restaurant was for birthdays or special occasions, not random Tuesday nights. Most meals were cooked at home, simple and filling, and eaten together at the table. There was something grounding about that ritual, something that told you, without words, that you belonged somewhere. Groceries cost less, yes, but we also wasted far less. Leftovers were a normal part of life, not a sign of struggle. Clothes weren't trendy, they were practical. You wore the same coat year after year, and no one thought twice about it. Shoes were repaired, not tossed. If something broke, you tried to fix it before even considering a replacement. That approach wasn't driven by fear, it was driven by common sense. My father didn't come home stressed about keeping up. He came home tired, yes, but settled. His job wasn't his identity, it was his responsibility. And because one income was enough, his evenings belonged to us. He'd sit in his chair, newspaper in hand, radio playing softly in the background, fully present in a way that feels rare now. There were no emails to answer, no late-night calls demanding more. Work ended when you punched out, and that boundary protected family life in ways we didn't fully appreciate at the time. Today, I watch younger families juggle multiple jobs, side gigs, endless expenses, and I wonder if they ever feel that same sense of arrival at the end of the day. In the 1970s, even without abundance, there was a shared agreement that life didn't have to be exhausting to be meaningful. One paycheck carried not just financial weight, but a rhythm that allowed families to breathe, to plan, and to trust that tomorrow wouldn't suddenly unravel everything they had built. Housing played a huge role in making that single paycheck enough, and when I look at home prices today, it almost feels unreal compared to what we had. Our first house wasn't big, it wasn't fancy, but it was solid, and more importantly, it was attainable. My father didn't need a lifetime of debt or a miracle loan approval to afford it. He worked a steady job, saved for a modest down payment, and that was that. The mortgage payment took its place alongside the other bills, predictable, manageable, never a constant source of panic. We didn't talk about housing markets or interest rate spikes. A house was a place to live, not an investment strategy. And because so many families lived within similar means, neighborhoods felt balanced. You didn't feel surrounded by people doing wildly better or worse than you. Everyone's lawn looked roughly the same. Everyone's car sat in the driveway with the same quiet dignity. That sense of equality created a kind of social calm. Kids played outside together without much thought about who had more or less. Inside the house, space was used carefully. Bedrooms were shared, basements doubled as playrooms. Dining rooms weren't decorative. They were used every day. Heating and cooling were modest too. We put on sweaters in winter and opened windows in summer. Comfort came from adaptation, not control. Today, we expect houses to satisfy every desire at the push of a button, and we pay dearly for that expectation. In the 1970s, the home felt like a partnership. You met it halfway, and it took care of you in return. My mother managed the household as if it were a profession, and in many ways, it was. She knew where every dollar went, when every payment was due, and how to stretch groceries until the next payday. That work didn't earn a salary, but it earned stability. And because the system allowed one income to sustain the family, that invisible labor mattered. I know times have changed, and I wouldn't pretend everything was fair or easy, but I can't ignore the difference in pressure. Back then, owning a home didn't feel like an impossible dream. It felt like a step in adulthood, something within reach if you were willing to live modestly and patiently. One paycheck was enough, because life itself demanded less. Less square footage, less constant consumption, and less comparison. And in that simplicity, families found something rare today, the quiet confidence that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. Transportation was another quiet reason why one paycheck could support an entire family in 1970s America, and it's something I don't think people talk about enough. Our family owned just one car, and that wasn't seen as a sacrifice. It was simply how life worked. That car belonged to the household, not to any one person. My father used it to get to work every morning, leaving at the same hour each day, his routine as steady as the sunrise. My mother planned her entire week around that schedule, carefully timing grocery trips, school pickups, and doctor visits. There was no frustration in that arrangement, no sense of inconvenience. We adapted to the car, not the other way around. The idea that every adult, and certainly every teenager, would need their own vehicle would have sounded excessive back then. The car itself wasn't new, and it wasn't meant to impress anyone. It was dependable, familiar, and paid for. Monthly payments weren't hanging over our heads for years. When something broke, it was fixed. My father kept a small set of tools in the garage, and many Saturdays were spent under the hood, teaching me without saying much, just by doing. That care extended the life of the car, and that alone saved money in ways that added up quietly over time. Gas was affordable, yes, but driving was also thoughtful. You didn't jump in the car out of boredom or habit. Every trip had a purpose. Errands were grouped together. Routes were planned. Walking wasn't seen as a failure. It was normal. Many stores were close enough that my mother could walk with a bag in each hand, waving to neighbors along the way. Kids rode bicycles everywhere, not for exercise, but because that was the most natural way to get around. Communities were built for people, not for traffic, and that design reduced costs without anyone needing to think about it. Insurance was simpler. Cars didn't come packed with fragile technology that drove up repair bills. A fender bender didn't threaten financial disaster. When you looked around the street at night, most driveways held a single car, sometimes none at all. And because everyone lived this way, no one felt deprived. Comparison didn't dominate our thoughts the way it does now. That's something younger generations may never fully understand. Today, transportation feels like a constant financial drain. Car loans, leases, insurance premiums, fuel costs, maintenance, and endless upgrades. Back then, the car was just another tool, like the refrigerator or the stove, and it fit neatly into a budget supported by one paycheck. Even more important than the money was the lesson it taught us. Life didn't need to be optimized every second. You learned patience, planning, and acceptance of limits. Those lessons carried into every part of family life. When one paycheck supported a family, it wasn't because everything was easy. It was because expectations were realistic, and people accepted a slower, more deliberate way of living that made financial balance possible. Education was another pillar that made one paycheck feel sufficient, and this is where the contrast with today becomes almost painful to think about. I went to public school, just like nearly everyone I knew, and it wasn't considered a compromise or a second-best option. It was simply where children went. The schools were funded well enough to provide solid education without draining families financially. There were textbooks passed down year after year, desks with initials carved into them from students long gone, and teachers who expected discipline, effort, and respect. Supplies were basic: pencils, notebooks, folders, and the cost of back-to-school season never threatened the household budget. There were no endless lists of mandatory devices, subscriptions, or specialized programs that parents had to scramble to afford. If you were accepted to college later on, tuition was high enough to be taken seriously, but low enough to be achievable with savings, part-time work, or modest loans. My parents didn't lose sleep wondering if my education would bankrupt them. That peace alone was priceless. College wasn't treated like a luxury product sold at a premium. It was an opportunity, not a life sentence of debt. And because not everyone was expected to go, there was dignity in choosing trades, apprenticeships, or entering the workforce directly after high school. A single income could still support a family, even if the children chose different paths. Because the system didn't punish ordinary choices, school life itself was simpler. After the final bell rang, school stayed at school. Homework existed, but it didn't consume the entire evening. Parents weren't expected to manage digital portals, constant emails, or daily performance tracking. My mother didn't feel pressured to monitor every academic metric. She trusted the teachers, and they trusted the parents. That mutual confidence reduced stress, which in turn reduced spending on tutors, special programs, and endless interventions. Extracurricular activities were modest too: sports teams, band practice, clubs. Most were funded through the school or small community fees. There was no expectation of private coaching, travel leagues, or expensive equipment. Children participated because they enjoyed it, not because it was an investment strategy for a future scholarship. Today, I see families pouring thousands of dollars into their children's schedules just to keep up, and I can't help but shake my head. In the 1970s, a child's education didn't feel like a financial gamble. It felt like a shared responsibility between family, school, and community. And because education stayed affordable and grounded, one paycheck didn't get swallowed by fear of falling behind. Learning was part of life, not a commodity sold to anxious parents. That balance allowed families to plan, breathe, and trust that their children could build a future without draining everything their parents had worked for. Healthcare was another quiet factor that allowed one paycheck to carry an entire family. And when I think about it now, it feels like a different country altogether. In the 1970s, going to the doctor didn't come with dread about the bill before you even walked through the door. My family had basic health insurance through my father's job, and that was enough. It wasn't perfect, but it covered checkups, emergencies, and the kind of care most families needed. Doctor visits were straightforward. You waited in a modest office, saw a physician who often knew you by name, and walked out without a stack of confusing paperwork. Bills arrived by mail, clearly written, and they were paid like any other household expense. No panic, no negotiating, no fear of financial ruin. Hospitals weren't gleaming corporate complexes. They were community institutions. The focus felt more human, less transactional. Prescription medications were affordable, and many common treatments cost little more than a few dollars. My parents didn't ration care or delay visits out of fear of cost. That security mattered more than we realized. When health isn't constantly threatening your finances, your entire outlook on life changes. Sick days weren't treated like catastrophes. Mental stress didn't compound physical illness. People healed at home, supported by family and neighbors, not buried under paperwork and debt. My mother handled appointments and follow-ups without needing to navigate complex networks or approval systems. Time itself was a form of care back then. Doctors weren't rushed. Conversations were longer. Trust mattered. That trust reduced unnecessary tests and treatments, which kept costs down for everyone. Today, I listen to younger families talk about deductibles, co-pays, uncovered services, and surprise bills, and it's hard to reconcile that with what we knew. Back then, medical expenses were part of life, not a looming financial threat. Serious illness was frightening, of course, but it didn't automatically mean losing your home or savings. That alone made one paycheck enough. It wasn't just about dollars. It was about predictability. You could plan a future without a constant fear that a single accident might destroy everything. That peace allowed families to focus on living, working, and caring for one another instead of bracing themselves for the next crisis. In the 1970s, healthcare fit into life. Today, for many, life is shaped around healthcare, and that shift has quietly undermined the idea that one income could ever be enough again. Entertainment in the 1970s was one of the quiet reasons a single paycheck could support a family. And looking back now, it's astonishing how little we needed to feel content. We didn't live under a constant barrage of options, notifications, and choices competing for our attention. Our home had one television set, usually sitting in the corner of the living room, heavy and boxy, with rabbit ear antennas that sometimes needed adjusting. It offered a small handful of channels, and every show aired at a specific time, whether you were ready or not. If you missed it, that was it. There was no recording, no replay, no endless library waiting for you. Oddly enough, that limitation made television more meaningful. When a favorite show came on, the whole family gathered together. Supper was timed around it, conversations paused. We laughed and reacted together, not alone in separate rooms with separate screens. There were no monthly bills quietly stacking up for entertainment services. What you watched came free over the air, and that fit perfectly into a household supported by one income. Radio played an even larger role than people remember today. It was always on somewhere in the house, filling the silence with music, baseball games, talk shows, and news. It cost nothing beyond the radio itself, yet it made the house feel alive. Music wasn't disposable back then. If you wanted an album, you saved for it. You brought it home carefully, slid it from its sleeve, and played it from start to finish. Every song mattered. Record collections grew slowly, thoughtfully, and they lasted for years. Movie theaters were affordable enough to be a treat without being a financial event. A family trip to the movies didn't require planning weeks in advance or cutting back elsewhere. More often than not, though, entertainment happened at home or outside. Board games came out after dinner. Card games lasted long into the evening. Conversations stretched without interruption. Kids spent most of their free time outdoors, riding bikes, playing ball, inventing games with rules that changed every day. None of it required admission fees, special equipment, or parental supervision every minute. Adults found pleasure in simple hobbies, working on a car, fixing something around the house, gardening, reading the newspaper cover to cover. There was no pressure to turn every interest into productivity or profit. Free time was allowed to exist as free time. Boredom wasn't considered dangerous. It was normal and often temporary. Today, entertainment feels endless but strangely empty, constantly asking for money, attention, and time without ever feeling complete. In the 1970s, entertainment had edges and limits, and those limits kept spending low while making shared moments feel richer. That simplicity allowed one paycheck to stretch further, but more importantly, it allowed families to feel together, present, and satisfied without constantly reaching for something more. Food and grocery shopping were another powerful reason one paycheck could support a family in 1970s America, and this is an area where the difference between then and now feels especially stark. We didn't think of food as entertainment or identity the way people seem to today. It was nourishment, routine, and care. My mother planned meals a week at a time, sometimes longer, writing everything down on a piece of paper kept in a kitchen drawer. There was no impulse buying driven by flashy packaging or constant promotions. You walked into the grocery store with a list, and you walked out with what was on that list. Stores themselves were smaller, quieter, and far less overwhelming. You weren't surrounded by dozens of nearly identical choices for the same item. One or two brands were enough. Prices were fair, predictable, and most importantly, they made sense in relation to a single income. Groceries didn't quietly double every few years without explanation. Meat was eaten in modest portions. A roast might stretch across several meals. Vegetables were simple, often canned or frozen, sometimes fresh if they were in season. Nothing was wasted. Leftovers were expected, saved, and appreciated. Throwing food away felt wrong, not just financially, but morally. Meals were cooked at home almost every day, not because eating out was forbidden, but because home cooking was normal. Restaurants were reserved for rare moments, birthdays, anniversaries, maybe a Sunday afternoon now and then. Eating out wasn't woven into daily life the way it is now, draining budgets without people realizing it. Breakfast was simple. Lunch was packed from home in brown paper bags. Supper was the main event, eaten together at the table, not in front of screens, not in separate rooms. That shared routine did more than save money. It created structure. Everyone knew when dinner was. Everyone knew they'd be there. The grocery bill was one of the largest expenses in the household, but it never felt out of control. My mother knew exactly how much she could spend each week, and she stayed within it. There were no surprise fees, delivery charges, or convenience costs layered on top. Food didn't arrive at the house wrapped in plastic and paper bags from half a dozen different places. You worked with what you had. That approach required time and effort, but it saved money, and more importantly, it built confidence. Today, food spending feels chaotic. Subscriptions, apps, delivery tips, specialty diets, endless snacking. all quietly eroding the idea that one income could ever be enough. In the 1970s, food fit into life instead of dominating it. Groceries were affordable, meals were intentional, and eating together reinforced the sense that the family unit mattered. That balance made one paycheck stretch further than any modern budgeting trick ever could. Clothing and personal spending were handled very differently in the 1970s, and this alone explains why one paycheck could stretch as far as it did. Clothes were bought out of necessity, not impulse or identity. My parents didn't shop for fun. Shopping was a task, planned and purposeful. Most families bought new clothes only a few times a year, before school started, maybe before winter, and occasionally for a special event. You didn't refresh your wardrobe every season because fashion wasn't changing at a frantic pace. Styles moved slowly, and that slowness saved money without anyone feeling deprived. When my mother took us shopping, it was often at department stores or local shops, and the goal was durability. Fabric mattered, stitching mattered, clothes were expected to last. You wore them hard, washed them carefully, and when they no longer fit or showed wear, they didn't automatically become trash. Older clothes were handed down to younger siblings. Shirts became play clothes. Jeans became work pants. Nothing about that felt embarrassing. It felt normal. Shoes were a good example. You owned 1 or 2 pairs at most. A pair for school or work, and maybe another for church or special occasions. When soles wore down, they were repaired. Today, shoes are treated as disposable fashion items, but back then they were tools meant to be maintained. Dry cleaning was rare. Fancy outfits were rare. Everyday life didn't require looking polished at all times. Appearances mattered, but excess didn't. That attitude extended to haircuts, cosmetics, and personal care. Hair was cut every few months, not every few weeks. Products were simple and used sparingly. There weren't aisles full of specialized items promising transformation. You used what you had until it ran out. Advertising existed, but it didn't follow you everywhere or speak to you personally. You weren't constantly told that something was wrong with the way you looked or lived. That alone reduced spending and anxiety. Children didn't feel pressure to keep up with trends because there weren't many to keep up with. Adults didn't feel the need to signal success through constant upgrades. Today, clothing budgets quietly balloon through fast fashion, online deals, free shipping thresholds, and constant returns. In the 1970s, the closet was smaller, but it was sufficient. That sufficiency mattered. It meant that one paycheck didn't disappear into endless personal spending. It meant families could budget with confidence, knowing that clothing was a seasonal expense, not a constant drain. And it taught us something deeper, that worth wasn't measured by novelty, and stability didn't require reinvention. When one paycheck supported a family, it wasn't because people denied themselves joy. It was because they understood the difference between need and noise, and they built their lives accordingly. Utilities and household expenses were another quiet but powerful reason one paycheck could support a family in the 1970s, and this is where restraint showed up in everyday living. Electricity, water, gas, and phone service existed to support life, not dominate it. We were constantly aware of usage, not because we were afraid, but because waste simply didn't make sense. Lights were turned off when you left a room. Thermostats stayed low in winter and high in summer, and no one complained much about it. You put on a sweater, grabbed a blanket, opened a window, or used a fan. Comfort came from adjustment rather than demanding perfect conditions. Air conditioning, if you had it, wasn't running all day and night. It came on when absolutely necessary. Heating systems were simple, reliable, and understood. My father knew how they worked. If something went wrong, he tried to fix it before calling anyone. That alone saved money and built confidence. Water wasn't treated as unlimited. Long showers weren't encouraged. Laundry was done once or twice a week, not daily. You waited until the machine was full. You didn't run appliances without thinking. The phone bill was predictable because there was only one phone, mounted on the wall, usually in the kitchen. Long-distance calls were rare and intentional. You didn't chat endlessly because each minute cost something. Conversations were meaningful because they were limited. No one carried a device that generated hidden costs every month. No data plans, no upgrades, no insurance, no accessories quietly adding up. When the bill arrived, it was exactly what you expected. That predictability mattered. Trash service was simple. Recycling wasn't formalized yet, but reuse was second nature. Jars were kept. Containers were repurposed. Old towels became rags. Nothing went straight into the garbage without serving every possible purpose first. Household items were purchased to last. Appliances weren't replaced every few years because a new model existed. They were repaired again and again. The idea of replacing something that still worked would have felt irresponsible. That mindset kept household expenses stable year after year. Today, utilities feel like a maze of fluctuating costs, hidden fees, subscriptions, and dependencies that didn't exist back then. We pay for speed, convenience, and constant connectivity without fully realizing the cumulative cost. In the 1970s, a household ran on fewer systems, fewer demands, and fewer expectations. That simplicity wasn't forced, it was accepted. And because daily living costs stayed predictable and modest, one paycheck could support a family without constant recalculation or stress. Home wasn't a place where expenses multiplied quietly in the background. It was a stable environment, designed to function within clear limits. Those limits didn't feel like deprivation, they felt like order. And that order made financial balance possible in a way that feels almost unimaginable now. Vacations and time off were handled in a way that fit naturally within the limits of one paycheck, and that difference says a lot about how expectations have shifted over the years. In the 1970s, a vacation didn't mean escape from life or an attempt to impress anyone. It meant rest, family time, and a change of scenery, usually close to home. Most families didn't fly across the country or overseas. We packed the car, loaded a cooler with sandwiches and drinks, and drove. Road trips were common, affordable, and filled with small rituals that made them memorable. Maps were folded and refolded on the dashboard. Kids played games in the back seat. Stops were planned around roadside diners, gas stations, and scenic pull-offs, not luxury accommodations. Lodging was modest, motor lodges, cabins, or staying with relatives. There was no expectation of perfection. A vacation didn't need to be curated or documented. It needed to be shared. Many families vacationed at the same place year after year, returning to familiar beaches, lakes, or campgrounds. Those places became part of our personal history. Because expectations were modest, costs stayed manageable. Time off work was limited but respected. When my father took vacation days, work truly paused. He wasn't reachable. No one expected him to check in. That mental separation allowed rest to actually restore him. Long weekends mattered. Holidays were cherished. Even staying home felt special because routines slowed down. Entertainment during vacations was simple. Swimming, fishing, walking, talking late into the evening. You weren't paying for constant activities. Children didn't expect theme parks or elaborate experiences. They expected togetherness. Today, vacations often come with pressure. Pressure to travel far, spend more, do more, and capture it all. Costs grow quickly, and time off rarely feels complete because work follows you. In the 1970s, time away fit within a single income because it wasn't designed to compete with anyone else's experience. It was designed to give families a break from routine without breaking the budget. That approach made rest sustainable rather than indulgent. Vacations didn't create debt or stress that lingered afterward. They ended and life resumed calmly. That balance allowed families to recharge without financial consequences. One paycheck could support a family not because people never traveled, but because travel stayed aligned with reality. Rest was valued, but excess wasn't. That distinction preserved both family bonds and financial stability in a way that feels increasingly rare today. Community support was something so deeply woven into life in the 1970s that most of us didn't even recognize it as a form of wealth. Yet it played a major role in why one paycheck could sustain a family. Neighbors weren't strangers passing each other in silence. They were familiar faces, known names, and steady presences. When my parents needed help, they didn't reach for a credit card or a paid service. They reached for the people around them. Someone always knew how to fix a leaky pipe, repair a fence, or babysit for an afternoon. Favors were exchanged naturally, without accounting or resentment. You watched your neighbor's kids because they had watched yours before. You brought food when someone was sick because you knew one day the gesture might be returned. This quiet web of mutual support reduced expenses in countless ways that never appeared on a budget. Childcare, in particular, was handled through trust instead of contracts. Mothers looked out for each other's children after school. Kids walked home together and stayed at a friend's house until dinner time without elaborate coordination. That trust lowered costs and stress at the same time. Churches, community centers, and local organizations also played a role. Events were inexpensive or free. Social life didn't revolve around spending money. It revolved around showing up. Potlucks, picnics, school events, and neighborhood gatherings filled the calendar without draining the wallet. When someone lost a job or fell on hard times, it was noticed and help often came quietly. Meals appeared. Odd jobs were offered. There was dignity in receiving help because it came from relationships, not systems. Today, many of those needs are outsourced to paid services, turning human connection into a line item. In the 1970s, community acted as a kind of informal insurance. That safety net allowed families to live with less financial padding because they weren't completely alone. My parents didn't worry constantly about worst-case scenarios because they trusted that if something happened, someone would step in until things stabilized. That trust lowered anxiety, and lower anxiety leads to lower spending. People didn't hoard resources or over-prepare out of fear. Life felt shared. Modern life often pushes families into isolation, where every challenge must be solved individually and paid for immediately. That isolation is expensive in every sense. In the 1970s, community reduced the need for excess income because support existed in human form. One paycheck was enough not only because expenses were lower, but because the burden of living wasn't carried by one family alone. We carried one another, often without realizing how valuable that truly was. The way we thought about work itself also shaped how one paycheck could support a family, and this is something that feels almost foreign today. In the 1970s, most jobs weren't built around squeezing every last ounce of productivity out of a person. My father's workday had a clear beginning and a clear end. He left in the morning, did his job, and came home. That was it. His employer didn't expect loyalty to extend into nights, weekends, or family life. There was an understanding, unspoken but firm, that work paid the bills, but it wasn't life itself. Because of that boundary, stress stayed contained. My father wasn't constantly worried about performance reviews, metrics, or reinventing himself to stay relevant. He did his job well, showed up consistently, and that was enough to keep a roof over our heads. Raises came slowly, but so did costs. Job stability mattered more than rapid advancement. Staying with one company for years, even decades, was common and respected. That stability allowed families to plan long-term. You didn't live with the constant fear that your income might disappear overnight. Benefits were simple and meaningful: health coverage, maybe a pension, paid holidays. The idea of a retirement that didn't depend entirely on personal investment accounts wasn't a fantasy. It was expected. That expectation shaped spending habits throughout life. You didn't feel the need to chase higher income at any cost because security already existed. Workplaces were human in size. Bosses knew employees' names. When something went wrong at home, understanding was often built in. My mother didn't need a backup plan involving paid childcare and emergency services because my father's job had enough flexibility to handle life's interruptions. Today, work follows people everywhere. Careers demand constant adaptation, learning, networking, and self-promotion just to stand still. That pressure forces families to earn more just to feel safe. In the 1970s, earning enough felt achievable without burning out. Pride came from providing consistently, not endlessly climbing. My father didn't identify himself by his job title. He identified himself by his role in our family. That shift alone changes how money works. When work supports life instead of consuming it, one paycheck can be enough. The job didn't need to give meaning to existence. It needed to give stability. And because it did, families lived without the constant emotional toll that drains both energy and income today. Debt, or rather the limited role it played in everyday life, was another reason one paycheck could sustain a family in the 1970s, and this difference may be one of the most overlooked. Debt existed, but it carried weight and seriousness. You didn't take it on casually. My parents viewed borrowing money as something reserved for major life moments, buying a home, maybe a car, never for daily living. Credit cards were uncommon, and those who had them used them cautiously. There was no idea of financing clothes, groceries, or small comforts. If you couldn't afford something with the money you had, you waited. And waiting wasn't seen as failure, it was normal. That restraint kept households from quietly bleeding money month after month. Bills arrived in envelopes, opened at the kitchen table, paid deliberately, and then put away. You knew exactly what you owed and why. There were no mysterious balances growing in the background. My father slept well at night because he understood our financial picture completely. There's a kind of peace that comes with that clarity. Today, debt is woven into nearly every purchase, and its cumulative effect forces families to earn more just to stay even. In the 1970s, interest didn't silently siphon off future income. That alone made one paycheck more powerful. Saving, even in small amounts, was treated as a habit, not an afterthought. A coffee can on top of the refrigerator, a small savings account at the local bank, these things mattered. You saved for what you wanted instead of borrowing against your future. That habit built patience and confidence. It also reduced anxiety, which again lowered spending. People weren't constantly reacting to financial emergencies because fewer of those emergencies were self-created. Advertising encouraged consumption, but it didn't have the personalized reach it does now. You weren't targeted based on fear, insecurity, or impulse. Choices were slower, and slower choices tend to be cheaper and wiser. When my parents talked about money, it wasn't whispered in panic. It was discussed calmly, seriously, and respectfully. That tone matters. It teaches children that money is a tool, not a trap. In modern life, debt has become invisible, normalized, and strangely emotional. People use it to cope, to soothe, to keep up. In the 1970s, debt was avoided because life wasn't built around constant dissatisfaction. One paycheck could support a family because it wasn't immediately diluted by interest, fees, and repayment cycles. Income belonged to the household, not to lenders. That difference may not sound dramatic, but over a lifetime it changes everything. Children's expectations were very different in the 1970s, and that alone eased the pressure on a household living on one paycheck. We simply didn't expect constant novelty. Toys were precious because they were limited. Birthdays and Christmas were the main times new things entered our lives, and that waiting made those moments feel magical. I still remember getting 1 or 2 gifts and feeling like I had received the world. There was no disappointment because comparison wasn't constant. We didn't know what everyone else had in real time. You found out weeks later, maybe at school, and by then it hardly mattered. Kids weren't surrounded by endless advertising aimed directly at them. Commercials existed, but they didn't follow you everywhere, whispering that you were missing out. Because expectations were modest, parents didn't feel like they were failing if they couldn't provide the latest thing. Play came from imagination, not purchases. A cardboard box could become a spaceship. A stick could become a sword. Friends were entertainment. Time itself was entertainment. That kind of childhood cost very little, but delivered everything a child really needed. School life reinforced that simplicity. No one expected parents to constantly upgrade lunches, backpacks, or wardrobes. What you brought was what you brought. Teasing existed, but it wasn't fueled by brands changing every few weeks. That reduced tension at home. My parents weren't negotiating daily over new wants. Maybe someday was an acceptable answer, and we believed it. That belief built patience instead of resentment. Today, I see parents exhausted not just financially, but emotionally, trying to meet expectations that never stop growing. In the 1970s, children grew up understanding limits early, and those limits felt natural. That understanding protected the family budget without anyone needing to enforce it harshly. When children don't expect excess, parents don't have to earn excess. One paycheck could support a family because the household wasn't constantly under pressure to keep up with an accelerating standard. Childhood wasn't curated or optimized. It unfolded slowly, imperfectly, and freely. That freedom didn't cost money, but it saved a great deal of it. And it created adults who were more resilient, more patient, and more grounded than many realize today. Retirement and the idea of the future were approached with a kind of quiet confidence in the 1970s that feels almost impossible to imagine now, and that confidence reinforced why one paycheck felt sufficient throughout a family's life. My parents didn't obsess over retirement accounts, investment strategies, or market swings. Not because they were careless, but because the system itself offered reassurance. If you worked steadily, showed loyalty, and did your job well, there was an expectation that you would be taken care of later on. Pensions weren't rare or exotic. They were part of the deal. Social Security was trusted as a real safety net, not a fragile promise constantly questioned. That trust shaped how families spent and saved. My father didn't feel pressured to extract every possible dollar out of his working years. He believed, reasonably, that when the time came, he would be able to slow down without fear. That belief reduced panic spending and reduced the need for excess income. Saving happened quietly and consistently, not aggressively. A small amount set aside regularly felt enough because the future didn't feel hostile. That sense of security spilled into everyday decisions. Big risks weren't necessary. There was no need to chase speculative gains or gamble with stability. Life was built on predictability rather than acceleration. Today, retirement feels like a moving target, forcing families to earn more just to feel marginally prepared. In the 1970s, preparation felt achievable. Aging wasn't feared in the same way. Older people were visible, respected, and integrated into family life. Grandparents often lived nearby or visited often. Their presence reminded us that life continued beyond work without collapse, that perspective mattered. It meant one paycheck could support a household without the constant anxiety of an uncertain ending. When the future doesn't feel like a threat, the present becomes calmer and cheaper. My parents weren't living with a sense of impending scarcity. They believed things would more or less work out, and that belief influenced everything from spending habits to emotional health. The future wasn't something to outrun. It was something to approach slowly. That mindset has almost vanished today, replaced by urgency and fear. In the 1970s, hope itself was a financial resource. And when hope is stable, income doesn't need to stretch as far to feel sufficient. When I step back and look at all of it together, what stands out most about life in 1970s America isn't any single expense, but the emotional climate in which money existed. There was a general sense that life was manageable. Not easy, not perfect, but manageable. That feeling shaped behavior in subtle but powerful ways. My parents weren't constantly bracing for impact. They weren't living as if one wrong move would collapse everything. Because of that, decisions were calmer, slower, and usually wiser. Anxiety is expensive, and there was simply less of it back then. People trusted institutions more. They trusted employers to be fair, schools to educate, doctors to heal, neighbors to help, and the future to unfold without constant intervention. That trust reduced the impulse to over-insure, over-plan, and over-consume. We didn't buy peace of mind because peace of mind was built into the way society functioned. That allowed one paycheck to feel sufficient even when it wasn't large. There was also less noise telling people they were falling behind. Without social media, 24-hour news cycles, and personalized advertising, families weren't constantly reminded of what they lacked. You compared yourself mainly to the people on your street, and most of them lived much like you did. That created emotional balance. When expectations stay grounded, expenses stay grounded too. Pride came from stability, not display. Providing for your family didn't mean offering constant upgrades. It meant showing up every day and keeping things steady. My father took that role seriously, but it didn't crush him. The responsibility gave him purpose, not panic. Today, responsibility often comes layered with fear of losing status, security, or relevance. That fear drives spending and forces households to chase income just to quiet it. In the 1970s, silence was easier to come by. Evenings were quieter. Minds were quieter. That quiet made contentment possible. Families accepted imperfection without labeling it failure. Things broke and were fixed. Plans changed and were adjusted. Life bent without snapping. That flexibility is another reason one paycheck was enough. The system had room for human error. Modern life feels far less forgiving. Every misstep is costly. Every delay punished. Looking back, I realize how much emotional resilience was built into everyday life. And resilience lowers costs. It reduces impulsive decisions, emergency spending, and constant upgrades. When people feel safe enough to be patient, money stretches further. In the 1970s, patience was a shared value, reinforced by slower systems and simpler expectations. That patience may be the most valuable thing we lost, and no amount of income today seems able to fully replace it. As an old man looking back now, what I miss most about 1970s America isn't the prices, the products, or even the wages. It's the feeling of alignment. Life made sense within its own limits. One paycheck supported a family not because people were smarter or tougher, but because society itself was calibrated for ordinary lives. Work, money, time, family, and community moved at roughly the same speed. Nothing was constantly racing ahead, demanding you catch up or be left behind. My father didn't feel like he was barely holding things together. He felt like he was doing what was expected of a man in his position, and that expectation was reasonable. That alone gave him dignity. My mother didn't feel invisible or undervalued. Her work inside the home mattered because the system allowed it to matter. Children didn't feel like burdens or financial risks. They were simply the next chapter, and the world made room for them. Today, everything feels misaligned. Costs rise faster than paychecks. Expectations grow faster than time. Fear moves faster than reassurance. We tell families they need more income, more credentials, more hustle, just to achieve what once came naturally. And then we wonder why people feel exhausted and overwhelmed. In the 1970s, exhaustion existed, but it was physical, honest, and temporary. You rested, and then you went on. There was faith that effort would be rewarded in proportion to what you gave. That faith allowed people to stop striving at some point and simply live. One paycheck was enough because life didn't constantly demand proof of worth. You didn't have to justify your existence through consumption or achievement. You belonged by default. Looking back, I see how many small, quiet choices added up to something sustainable. Modest homes, shared cars, home-cooked meals, limited debt, real community, trusted institutions, and clear boundaries between work and life. None of these things were glamorous, but together they formed a system that worked for ordinary people. I don't pretend we can simply rewind the clock. The world has changed too much for that. But I do believe there's value in remembering how it once felt to live without constant financial fear. How it felt to know that one income, carefully managed, could support a family with dignity. These memories aren't about longing for a perfect past. They're about understanding what we lost along the way and why so many people today feel like they're running harder just to stay in place. When I tell these stories, I'm not trying to convince anyone that the 1970s were better in every way. I'm simply bearing witness to a time when ordinary life felt possible. And maybe, by remembering that, we can begin asking better questions about the kind of future we want to build. Not one where survival requires constant struggle, but one where stability, simplicity, and human connection once again make room for families to breathe.